Now, with that, we will be moving on to our journal club. Now, Dr. Winsky, we know that you have a busy schedule, so if you need to leave at any time, just feel free to leave whenever.
I'll tag along just to hear how well you guys have prepared.
Wonderful then. All right. So then with that, we're going to start with our consensus statement. So that's going to be by Miss Samantha Lopez, an undergraduate from Keiser University. Sam, could you share your screen?
Yep.
Wonderful.
Okay, do you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, so good evening, everyone, and thank you, Sam, for the introduction. Tonight, I will be presenting two reports conducted by Fuller et al. In 2007, a framework for recording recurrences, reinjuries, and exacerbations in injury surveillance, and consensus statement on injury definitions and data collection procedures for studies of injuries in rugby union. There have been inconsistencies when reporting data on rugby injuries due to variations in definitions and methodologies. At the same time, there is evidence that consensus statements on injury definitions for both cricket and football have had a significant positive impact. Through this, the aim of establishing operational definitions and methodologies for studies of injuries in rugby union was then formed. In terms of the method, the football consensus statement was used as a basis for rugby because there are more similarities in definitions and methodologies than cricket. A rugby injury consensus group, RICG, was then formed from the International Rugby Board, the IRB, Medical Advisory Committee. They were then responsible for assessing whether changes in the football statement were needed to better fit the rugby union consensus statement. After discussion, it was clear that some changes were required. So in their report, the authors focus more on when the consensus statement for rugby union departs from the football statement. Here are the following definitions that were accepted for the rugby union. An injury is any physical complaint which was caused by a transfer of energy that exceeded the body's ability to maintain its structural and or functional integrity that was sustained by a player during a rugby match or rugby training, irrespective of the need for medical attention or time lost from rugby activities. A medical attention injury is when a player receives medical attention, and a time loss injury is when a player is unable to take full part in future rugby training or match plays. A recurrent injury is defined as an injury of the same type and at the same site as an index injury, and which occurs from a player's return to full participation from the index injury. If it recurs within 2 months of a player's return to full participation, it's referred to as an early recurrence. If it's between 2 to 12 months after, it's a late reoccurrence, and a delayed reoccurrence is more than 12 months after. Injury severity is then measured by the number of days that have elapsed from the date of injury to the date of the player's return to full participation in team training availability for match selection. Match exposure was also defined as play between teams from different clubs. A and B trial teams should be treated as though they were in separate clubs, and match exposure should be recorded for a fully refereed competitive trial match between these teams. Finally, training exposure was defined as team-based and individual activities under the control or guidance of the team's coaching or fitness staff that are aimed at maintaining or improving players' rugby skills or physical condition. The decision framework to the right summarizes scenarios in which recurrent injuries may occur. The first subdivision of recordable injuries is based on whether the injury is a new or recent injury, depending on whether the player had returned to full participation. Recurrent injuries are further categorized to a re-injury, which is a repeat episode of a fully recovered index injury, and an exacerbation, which is a worsening of a non-recovered index injury, causing the player to miss further training and or match play. Rugby injury surveillance studies should not incorporate variations in the definition of injury. Table 1 on the right highlights an example of how specific incidents should be recorded using the medical attention and time loss of severity regimes. Reporting categories proposed were broadly accepted. However, they were subject to minimal change in regard to the headings used for main groupings. And to reflect the injury profile in rugby union, categories within groupings were added. Below, Table 2 displays the main groupings and categories that should be used in rugby union. In conclusion, the football consensus statement, definitions, and methodology seem to be the most appropriate for rugby union. By adopting these similarities, meaningful intersport comparisons of results can be made. However, minor variations were conducted to reflect specific issues associated with rugby union. Now, data quality should be improved due to the rugby union consensus statement, and there is now a basis for future studies, and they are supported by the IRB. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sam, for that presentation. Dr. Lopez, do you have anything to chime in?
Yeah, everyone. Thank you so much, Sam. That was very nice and concise. The importance of what we're looking at here, obviously, with the consensus statement, is it gave a baseline of how we should compare apples to apples. And as I stated, going forward, we will definitely only use the consensus statement. This is the statement that's been approved on the planet. And again, many people can diverge from that, but it'll be very hard for their papers to be compared back to the historical data over the past decade, which has really improved injury prevention within sports overall by setting up the standard. Again, it was a really nice job and concise and understanding the definitions. So let's proceed and we'll go through some more.
All right, great. Next up is going to be Ruth. Ruth, can you share your screen?
Okay. Okay. My name is Ruth, and today I'll be presenting recommendations for defining and classifying anterior cruciate ligament injuries in epidemiological studies by Stephen W. Marshall. Oh no, it's okay. The overall purpose of this study was to discuss the current knowledge on ACL injuries and to propose an effective method to classify them. But before going into how the author systematically redefined what a non-contact ACL injury is, it's important to illustrate and discuss what it looks like. So as you can see in the pictures, an ACL can be injured in several different ways, but the main mechanism is through the twisting or cutting motion in the knee. And of course, this is common in rugby and other contact sports as well. Oh no. Wait, it's fine.
You're doing fine. Go ahead. Keep going, Ruth. All right. Just try to go through it.
It's just a bit crunched, but whatever. Overall, this feeds into major methodological limitations that can reduce the validity and overall reliability of a study because trainers and other sports professionals can interpret the term as they wish. And for example, the lack of standardization when comparing differences across sexes is a nightmare because, for example, the inclusion or exclusion of certain cases can skew results and yield unreliable findings. It is also important to note that this negative effect can also make cross-study comparisons extremely problematic, as different definitions within methodologies can make this a very daunting task, as each definition is, although slightly different, can incur different cases being ousted out of the pool of data. Overall, the lack of standardization in the definition of non-contact has implications. As I said before, trainers can interpret whatever meaning, can ascribe any meaning to the definition as they wish, and this could lead to many studies being conceptually similar, but they can't be compared, which makes them collectively dissonant. Overall, the author proposes a more standardized definition of an ACL injuries as either a surgical reconstruction to repair a torn or ruptured ACL or a non-surgical management of a torn or ruptured ACL. And the author finds this suitable because it was confirmed by MRI and the clinical examination of the knee, and also 75 patient narratives from a standardized injury questionnaire. So overall, it can be said that this is both reliable and valid. The author, along with this, proposes a classification system for non-contact ACL injuries known as NCIC, or non-contact/indirect contact. And the author splits the classification into 4 major subgroups known as the DC, or direct contact, where the knee is directly blown, and the contact to the knee is identified as the main cause of injury. Indirect contact, where the knee is not struck directly, but the actual player's movements disturbs their motion and causes a physical imbalance. Therefore, their injury results from their own movement. And the other 2 subgroups, known as the ONC and the CNC, or other non-contact and classical non-contact, address the motor disruption or cognitive perturbation aspect of non-contact injury, in which a player's planned course of action is disrupted due to a sudden rapid change of where they need to place their footing, for example. And the main difference between the 2 is that ONC refers to an ACL, a non-contact ACL injury occurring during non-sport activities, while the CNC refers to an ACL injury from sporting activities. Overall, the study provides a reliable and valid method to classify non-contact ACL injuries, but also defines what non-contact injuries are in the context of non-contact and contact studies. And that's my presentation.
All right, thank you, Ruth. That was actually really good. With
Yes.
that,
I think that you did a great job on that last slide. Now, again, with the other non-contact, you have to also take into consideration, and you're not going to believe it, but just walking incorrectly or excessive celebration. So I don't know if everyone knows baseball, but Mariano Rivera, he was in the outfield and he was just walking. He was actually walking backwards and he popped his ACL. So that would be like an other non-contact because he was actually walking back to the bullpen or walking from the bullpen, and he uniquely ruptured his ACL. Now, another unique aspect would be, again, he wasn't playing the sport direct, but he was in uniform, so it was very, very unique. Excessive celebration. You have these players now do these dances in the end zones, the try zones, whatever you want to say it, or even post goal in hockey. You know, the one player did a pirouette, and I think he was on the Blues, and he tore his ACL. So these things occur in an awkward manner, but not in the sports per se capacity. Also, the excessive celebration. You've seen players on the sidelines jump up and down for their team when they win a score. Think about if you have an A-side player jumping up and down and he pops his ACL. This is the other non-contact. It's very unique. Now, just to go into the direct and indirect, direct contact and indirect contact. Direct contact is if I tackled you into your knee and I popped your ACL. Meanwhile, if I tackled you at the knees did not pop your ACL, but then you ended up driving your shoulder into the ground and ending up with a acromioclavicular injury. That's a indirect contact injury. Everyone understand? So just very unique in organizing those definitions. That's what we've been applying to our data set. So anyway, again, very nice. I like your table. All right, please, Sam.
All right, thank you, Ruth. Next up is Meghan Moir, one of our summer interns from Hood College. Meghan, can you share your screen?
Hi, Sam. Thank you for the introduction. My presentation is going to be on the influence of methodological issues on the results and conclusions from epidemiological studies of sports injuries by Brooks and Fuller. So just a little background, epidemiology studies provide data required for the development, application, and assessment of injury causation and injury prevention models. The aim of the article was to illustrate the effects that variations in research designs and methods of analysis can have on study conclusions based on data obtained from an epidemiological study of injuries in professional rugby union. The study involved medical personnel at 12 of the 13 rugby union teams that competed in the English Premiership during the 2002-2003 season and the 2003 and 2004 season. And they took data on match and training injuries. In epidemiology studies, the three most common ways of reporting injuries are absolute numbers of injuries, proportions of injuries, and incidences of injuries. Absolute numbers and proportions of injury cannot provide information about the incidence or the risk of injuries, and they can't quantify relationships between risk factors and injuries in the same population. Also, the results presented as numbers or proportions are limited because they do not account for different exposure levels. This is shown in the figure to the right because although there was a continuous fall in the monthly number of injuries reported over the September to March period, September to May period shown, the incidence of injury remained relatively consistent, but the continuous fall was due to the decreasing amount of games played each month, which reduced match exposure. There are also ways in which the way injuries are reported that can be misleading. If contact and non-contact injuries during training and competition were compared, there would be the impression that non-contact injuries are less of a problem during competition than training, when the incidence of non-contact injuries was actually 20 times greater during competition. Also, combining small numbers of match and training injuries to form a single compound group to report the pattern and incidence of injuries is misleading because the results depend on the ratio of training to match exposures. Injuries in these studies have been consistent based under the definitions of medical treatment and loss of time to fully inclusive. Medical treatment incorporates injuries requiring treatment by a team physician, whether or not they result in loss of time from competition or training. Loss of time to fully inclusive incorporates injuries that result in loss of time from competition or training. The loss of time to semi-inclusive, which is instead of loss of time to fully inclusive, it's half inclusive. It only incorporates injuries that result in loss of time from competition. Although the definitions of those terms are consistent, it has been found that studies using the medical treatment definition as opposed to the loss of time fully inclusive can generate large numbers of minor injuries, while studies using the other one reflect the immediate impact of injuries on players and clubs. but this definition still does not account for the idea that an injury from one sport might not stop the athlete from playing another. Various methods are used to collect exposure data and to calculate incidence of injury, with the most common methods being injuries per 1,000 player hours of exposure, injuries per 1,000 athlete exposures, injuries per 1,000 matches. These formats actually produce very different results. As you can see down below, the injuries per 1,000 player hours showed that the probability for injury to forwards and backs was the same, while the data for injuries per 1,000 athlete exposures represented that backs were going to be more injured than forwards. And the third format I mentioned, the injuries per 1,000 matches, did not even take into account the number of athletes involved, and it indicated that forwards were more susceptible to injuries than backs. This provides a huge issue, especially when epidemiology studies do not record actual number of days lost, because they cannot provide information about the severity values. So to conclude all of this, all the examples in this presentation illustrated fundamental issues that can and will affect the results and conclusions obtained from epidemiology studies. The outcomes represent how important it is to have an appropriate research design to reflect the injuries and study population, because it is very clear that two independent studies that are trying to solve the same problem can produce very different results and conclusions based on the research design. Thank you.
All right, great work, Meghan.
Yeah, it's a very good job, Meghan. The unique thing, I think they showed it, you'd be surprised that they even use another 6 to 10 variables. Some studies do 100 player hours, some use 100 athletic exposures. The NCAA uses athletic exposures. So it's whatever experience that player encountered with the injury. That's not as exact as the 1,000 player hours. That's why we use 1,000 player hours, because that is more exact and that follows the IOC's recommendations, the International Olympic Committee's recommendations for consensus statements. I was just very fortunate to do everything from the beginning to make sure that we were going to have a strong data set in the long run. Now going on our 10th year, and due to probably Michael's help and everyone that's been before him. The importance here is you want to compare equivalently. And again, I think there was a statement in there that said you can incorrectly calculate by not pulling the populations together. So if you pull a small amount of numbers to make sure your numbers look bigger by including preseason, training, match exposure, and not breaking those up, that's incorrectly presenting the data. That's falsely misleading. And that's what, that's what you want to make sure you do not do in the study. You want to make sure it's reproducible, and that if you share your methodology, it can be reproduced by anyone. All right, thank you very much. Let's keep going, everyone.
All right, next up is going to be Miss Orin Pramanik. She's a fourth-year medical student at the American University of Antigua College of Medicine. Orin, can you share your screen?
Thanks, Sam. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, alrighty. I'm sorry, guys. I'm having a little issue with my Wi-Fi, but I'm gonna just go with it. So
not a problem. It looks good. Go ahead.
Thanks. So this article was basically about coding OSICS, sports injury diagnosis and epidemiological studies. Does the background of the coder matter? And yeah, it does matter. So the objective of this article was to compare the OSICS-10 sports medicine diagnosis assigned by a clinical coder, which was the sports physician, I believe, and a non-clinical coder, which was an epidemiologist, I think. So there was 3 quoters, and the first 2 quoters were the sports physician, who has like extensive experience in clinical studies, versus the epidemiologist, who does not have a clinical background, but they do have a lot of experience in analysis and reporting of the sports injury data. And then if the first 2 quoters disagreed, then a biomechanist would make the judgment, and they do not have as much understanding of the OSICS-10, but they do, I believe, have the clinical background to make that judgment. So you have these 3 quoters, and then you have these 4 characteristics that are assigned to each injury. And so the first and second characters are agreed upon by both the physician and the epidemiologist. So like the anatomical location. For example, if there was an injury and a player hurt his back, you know, it's like anatomical location is the back itself. So both the physician and the epidemiologist would understand, okay, it's the back. And then the second character, which is the specific injured tissue or pathology of the injury, is also understood by both quoters. But it's the third and fourth character that becomes a place of disagreement, because this third and fourth character goes further into describing the pathology and broadens the diagnosis. So that's why the first 2 quoters would disagree on the third and fourth characters, and then the third quoter, which is the biomechanics, would make the last judgment as to what exactly is the injury. So if you could see here with the AFAX, it's the X and Z that seem to be causing the disagreements, whereas AFAX, fracture of the tibia and fibula, which you could see here, usually happen together. And it's a very common fracture. So that's why I believe that both the quoters agree on this much faster than they would in a fracture of the talus of the ankle, which you could see here. If the talus was injured, then it could be only a bone injury, or it could be like avascular necrosis, or it could just be a hematoma. And so if the epidemiologist doesn't have full knowledge of the clinical basis, then they wouldn't agree on exactly what the sports physician what the sports physician would be saying as well. So that's where the disagreement would come about. So overall, both quoters usually agreed on most of the cases. It was, I believe, only like 8 cases where the biomechanics didn't agree at all. So this is the injury incidence report form that they used, as you could see. And then the study method was a randomized control trial, which is one of the best types of study methods, because the biomechanics was actually blinded to both the background of the quoters. So that helped him not be like swayed by any of the judgments. And as I said, overall, they both did agree on most of it. Most of the agreements were due to just generalization, like I was telling you about, like the epidemiologist might just say back, whereas the physician might say specifically the lumbar spine. So that's where the issues came about. But overall, it is important for all quoters to have a very good clinical background, and in order to, in the future, maybe decrease the amount of misagreement, we could try to implement like a tick box option. That way, there would be less discrepancy between the quoters. So that's about it.
Thank you, Orin. The unique thing about this paper is, again, I was very fortunate to be exposed to the Oslo Sports Trauma Research Center, where they were doing all of these studies or just beginning to pull these studies out on the epidemiology and the higher level epidemiology studies, where I knew that we had to do something better. And so we used an athletic trainer from the beginning, or a physician or a medical student to collect our data.
Right.
Now with that, it's so funny because I think only like 4 years ago did they actually put out a paper that athletic trainers had the a high coefficient, kappa coefficient. That means that there was a strong correlation between a sports physician or physician and an athletic trainer to diagnose correctly, almost something like 95%, 96%. And that's what kind of percentages you want. So we've been very lucky that we've only used these quality data collectors from the beginning. That's one. We also went to a tick box method, and Michael knows about this from our RISE report. I don't think, because we haven't collected data, Michael, no one's been able to see the RISE report just yet. So they've been fortunate not to be out in the field. But I think, as Michael will tell you, it's a very unique experience being out there. And again, we rely on you out there and your knowledge base to diagnose these injuries. You know, give us a prognosis, and you're working with the medical staff that's there already. Mike, you got any comment on that? You've been with us out there in the field. Some of the major events too.
Give me 1 second. Let me plug in my headphones so it's we don't have an echo here.
So the beneficial thing that I really saw from like our major collection events, you know, we went to Las Vegas Invitational, College Rugby Championships. Some of those bigger events did have a pretty substantial medical coverage at them. They had physicians, they had trainers, they had physical therapists there. And so when we did have consent from the athletes to take their to collect the data from them, we could listen in on the questions that the practitioners were asking, and then that could kind of we use that plus the motive or the mechanism of injury. You kind of figure out, you can start to piece together kind of what's going on here, and you can see trends through all of the events. Like certain events had, you know, turf versus dirt versus sand versus great grass. You could tell differences in the level of competition of the kinds of injuries that were coming in. So, you know, you got to learn a lot, not only about the sport, but about biomechanics and injury mechanics of this pretty violent sport. And overall, like, it kind of makes you aware of what are all the pieces necessary to determining what's happened to this individual, what we can do in the meantime to start their recovery process right away, and then what we can do further down the line. Collecting all that data gives us the ability to look back into the rule book, into the law book of rugby, and determine whether or not there are certain things like the breakdown that can be improved upon, or the scrum that can be improved upon to decrease the amount of injury, to lessen the load of injury on the players. So yeah, it was very, very, it's a very, I'd say it's fun from the side that you get to go to a tournament, you get to see what it's all about, but you also get to go to the big events and the production that's put into it. And then, you know, you get to connect with the athletes and you get to see the game that they love to play and they want to keep playing for as long as they can.
Yeah, again, I think it's Michael's trying to, I guess, describe the RISE report, and what we do is we collect all these points of information, and it gives us a strong picture of what the player encountered at that juncture. And even you can think of each RISE report as its own little case study. And, you know, it's very unique in what we've done. So again, I think I'd like to say that, you know, Orin, you did a great job with that. That's another good paper that I want to make sure we went over, because I want to make sure that we had all the definitions covered. And again, there are more. Sam, do we have any more lecturers at the moment?
Yeah, we have two more. We have Kiera and Tiffany.
Great. Why don't we continue then, please?
All right. Yeah, so actually building off the Orin's paper is going to be Kiera. She's our intern from Washington Lee University. Kiera, can you please share your screen?
Okay, can everyone see that and hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, hold on one second. So today I will be discussing the revision, uptake, and coding issues related to the Open Access Orchard Sports Injury Classification System, or OSICS. OSICS is a 4-character hierarchical system for coding injury diagnoses in sports medicine. For these authors, the goal of the paper was to first document the uptake of OSICS in sports medicine organizations around the globe. Second, to discuss problems with its implementation. Third, to present the most updated versions of OSICS. And finally, and most importantly, to suggest standard injury categories organized by sport. They collected their data through literature searches and informal consultations with programmers and athlete management systems who had previously installed and used the software. What they found is that 7 large groups worldwide are currently using the OSICS system. The authors also mentioned the addition of the 4th character to the code, which we learned about in the last presentation. And additionally, the authors recorded that coding discrepancies are one of the main issues with diagnostic coding in their system. To counteract this issue, the authors suggested using filters by body part, injury type, or using other keywords to try and decrease the list of options for the coders and thereby decrease the coding discrepancies. The authors also made standard injury categories by merging O6 codes together. So shown here are injury categories for knee injuries listed from 91 to 99. They also created standard injury categories by sport. In these tables, Australian football and cricket are shown. Body parts and injuries are further combined in these tables, and the combinations are dependent upon the frequency of injuries in a sport. So if an injury is relatively uncommon in a sport, then it will likely be combined with other injuries that are similar in nature. So we can see this by first looking at 91, which is a knee ACL injury. For Australian football, this is also listed as knee ACL, but for cricket, it has a more generic listing of just knee ligament injuries. And again, with 97, patella instability, we can see that it's listed as a patella injury for Australian football, but once again, more generically for cricket as just an other knee injury. It's clear from these classifications that knee injuries probably aren't very common in cricket and therefore don't normally warrant their own categories. The authors emphasize that it's important that different sports start to discuss and agree upon which injuries would require their own categories and which could be combined together. The authors also propose and suggest that the hybrid tables that they created, which are shown here for Australian football and cricket, are helpful for studying the frequencies of what would be considered common injuries, such as like a hamstring injury. OSICS is a free program, which makes it easily accessible and very popular. At the same time, however, due to a lack of funds, it's difficult to keep the system up to date. The authors' 2 main conclusions were, 1, that researchers should continue to form consensus statements and update their consensus statements to address injury diagnoses, And 2, that injury diagnoses should be broadened wherever possible according to the sport. The authors suggest that increasing the complexity of coding, although beneficial in some ways, can limit its diagnostic reliability, as coders will tend to agree less often with the entire code. And they suggest that broader injury categories, such as those shown in the tables they generated in their paper, could help create more common ground between research methodologies and make intersport comparisons not only easier, but have higher validity as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kiera.
Yeah, thank you. Did a great job with that presentation as well. I think the OSIC system is what our our data collection is based upon, because that's what the original consensus statement and the original association football or soccer consensus statement was based upon. And so since then, everyone's always followed it. We've added some extra, that fourth letter, we've added some extra components to it to give us more detail of the matters, giving us a couple extra columns. And again, that would probably be in more detail when we discuss, locations of facial lacerations or locations of lacerations. You get what I mean? So it's very unique in that aspect. But again, this is all very important stuff. So let's go to the next definition, please.
All right, Tiffany, you'll be closing off. Tiffany Smith is a medical student from Rutgers University. Can you share your screen?
Yes. Okay, so I will be presenting on subsequent injury definition, classification, and consequence. And like Sam said, I'm Tiffany Smith. I'm a rising M2 at Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson. So let's get started. So the overall objective of this study was to pretty much examine if different definitions of subsequent injury and their types affect the distribution of subsequent injury analysis. And so for this study, unlike some of the other studies we've looked at, rather than using sports, circus artists were used and their injury data was collected. So overall, 1,281 circus artists were followed. Their injury data was collected from August 2004 to March 2008. And the therapists associated with the circus were utilized to not only take the injury information and treatments from all of these artists, but enter it into an electronic database. So then the frequency of the different types of subsequent injuries, which I'll get into the definitions specifically for new, local, and recurrent are, as well as the type of injury, so whether it was a medical attention injury or a time loss injury, which definitions I'll also talk about in the next slide, we'll get to. And then lastly, they looked at the number of performances between the subsequent injury and the initial index injury. So to begin with the definitions they used for subsequent injury, there were 3 definitions: new, local, and recurrent injury. New injury being a different location than the index injury. So if you initially had an ankle sprain, a new injury would be maybe a shoulder injury, so an injury at a different location. Then they had local injury. So we're talking same location, but different type. So that could be 2 injuries at the ankle, but types of injuries would be different. Next, they had recurrent injury, which would be an injury of the same location and same type. So with the example of ankle sprain again, that would be having an ankle sprain and then getting another ankle sprain. The next definitions that we should talk about are the timing of subsequent injury. So for this specific study, they looked at performances because they were following circus artists. So an early subsequent injury would be an injury 90 performances or less from the initial index injury. A late injury would be between 91 and 540 performances later, whereas a delayed injury was found to be, or they classified as greater than 540 performances after the initial index injury. The next injury definitions we have to go over are the 2 different types of injury. So there were medical attention injuries where you know, you got an injury and then you went to the medical tent and you were seen or treated, in comparison to a time loss injury, which we're talking about having some type of absence from playing the sport. So if you're in a 2-day circus type of event, if you got an injury on the first day, that could be you not being able to perform on that second day. So this was a figure that they had in the paper that I thought was a pretty nice flow of how they were able to classify. So they had their first reportable injury, and then they said, okay, is it actually an injury? No or yes. If it was, then you got that as your index injury, your first injury. Then it goes down to second recordable injury. So did you have an injury? Yes. So now we know that you have a subsequent injury. Did you not? No injury. And then again, from that subsequent injury, was it at the same location as that initial index or not? If it wasn't, then you have a new injury, a new subsequent injury, in comparison to if you said yes, you have either a recurrent injury or a local injury at that same site. And then based on whether what the type of injury you had would determine whether it was recurrent or local. And then lastly, was it healed or not? And that would be a re-injury versus an exacerbation. You can think of an exacerbation as being something like if you had a laceration and someone just sewed it up, but it was never actually healed and then you hurt it again. So in terms of results, out of the 1,281 artists they had, 64% of them had 2 medical injuries, so classified as some type of subsequent injury. They found that the majority of subsequent injuries were actually new injuries in comparison to recurrent or local injuries, so people were injuring new sites more frequently. And then lastly, no higher consequences were associated with the subsequent injury in comparison to the associated index injury. So when we think about consequences, a lot of times you can think about the time that you're out from whatever thing you're looking at. So in this case, it would be how much time you're out from being able to participate in the circus. So that was found to not have any higher consequence, that subsequent injury, in comparison to the index. And then for the overall conclusion, really, they found that using a classification system for subsequent injuries could be really helpful for researchers and clinicians. It could really help to best address whatever your particular research question is, because as they were able to see in this study, new injuries definitely outweighed recurrent or local subsequent injuries. So making sure you know what you're asking and how you classify your subsequent injury could really influence your results. And that is it.
All right, well, thank you, Tiffany. And to the people on our call, thank you for joining us. We'll be hanging it up now. All right, goodbye until next week.